Good friend and president, is that correct, of the Birmingham Islamic Society, who will actually introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Before I introduce, I just want to set the stage. In 2014, in the State of Union address, President Obama, in one part of his speech, talked about the marginalized communities. He talked about Jewish community, he talked about LGBT, and there was a bipartisan applause in the House. And then he talked about the Muslims and Arab, and there was a bipartisan silence in the House. So we've got a lot of work to do. After the 2016 divisive and contentious election season, Tina, I, Refugee Interest Committee from Unitarian Church, we met, and one of the goals we set that we are going to make 2017 and onwards a time for education and advocacy. And this week has become a prime example. We had a program on the Rohingya Muslims genocide yesterday. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Zoghby with us, and God willing, Thursday, we're going to have a program by Jerry Levin on the Middle East peace process. So there is an uphill battle and a challenge that we need to face. And today, hopefully, Dr. Zoghby is going to share with us, a renowned speaker, a renowned scholar for that part of the world. So I'm going to introduce to the best of my ability, but you know, everybody should know Dr. Zoghby and his work that goes on. Thank you. Dr. James Zoghby co-founded Arab American Institute in 1985 and continues to serve as a president. Since then, Dr. Zoghby and AAI, Arab American Institute, you know, all these WhatsApp messages you get, and you, I'm not joking with you, so you lose your, and they have led Arab American efforts to secure political empowerment in the US. Through voter registration, education, and mobilization, AAI has moved Arab Americans into the political mainstream. He is a member of the Executive Committee of the Democratic National Convention Committee and was twice appointed by President Obama to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in 2013. In addition to writing a weekly column published in 12 countries, Dr. Zoghby is a creator and host of the award-winning call-in political television program show Viewpoint, and is frequently featured on national and international media as an expert on Middle East affairs. In 2010, Dr. Zoghby published the highly acclaimed book, Arab Voices, his 2013 ebook looking at Iran, the rise and fall of Iran in Arab public opinion, and 20 years after Oslo, are drawn from his extensive polling across the Middle East with Zoghby Research Services. Dr. Zoghby has testified before US House and Senate committees, has been guest speaker on a number of occasions in the Secretary's Open Forum at the United States Department of State, and has addressed the United Nations and other international forums. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Public Service Award from US Department of State in recognition of his outstanding contribution to national and international affairs. Dr. Zoghby received his doctorate from Temple University, Department of Religion, where he studied under a renowned Islamic scholar, Dr. Ismail Al-Faruqi. He was a National Endowment for the Humanities postdoctorate fellow at Princeton University in 1976, and on several occasions was awarded grants for research and writing by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Defense Education Act, and the Mellon Foundation. Dr. Zoghby received a Bachelor's of Arts from Des Moines College. It is my great pleasure to have Dr. Zoghby amongst us today, and hopefully we are going to be better educated about that part of the world today than we were yesterday. Thank you, Dr. Zoghby.
Thank you. I had no idea when I was coming here that I was going to be in the epicenter of craziness. I come from what I thought was the epicenter of craziness in Washington, but you've got a lot. I'm not going to get into it, but you've got a lot going on here right now.
Yes, we do.
I'll just let that go. I mean, it's, you know, I said to people, I'm coming to Birmingham. Oh. I thank you, Tina, for the invitation, and thank those of you who are here tonight. I'm going to talk about the Middle East, what we know, what we don't know, the mistakes we make because we don't know, and what we can do about it. But let me just start by saying that, you know, as deficient as our overall educational programs are in the country, as deficient as our popular media culture and political culture might be, I find in almost every city amazing resources that people can draw on to learn more. And just standing outside and being reacquainted with some old friends from Yemen, from South Yemen in particular, make me ever more aware of the fact. You want to know what's going on in Yemen? You got guys here who know it inside and out. You want to know what's going on with the Arab-Israeli conflict and with problems of American foreign policy in the region? You got Jerry and Sis Levin right here in your midst. They're heroes going way back. Jerry's story is legendary in Washington media circles and in political circles, and the work that Sis did to help free Jerry and the hostages that were held after the U.S. bombardments in Lebanon, the story that they can tell is something that will educate all of you if you take time to just ferret it out. A lot of learning happens in classrooms. There's no question about that. But a lot more learning happens when we just meet people and probe and listen. My book, Arab Voices, which is I've written lots of books, but this one was one of my favorites because it was about listening. And my mom used to tell me from the time I was little, and I'd get into arguments. I was one of those kids who always knew better than anybody else until I learned that I actually didn't know better than anybody else. Needed to listen. She'd tell me, you weren't listening to your aunt when you were arguing with her. You were sitting at the edge of your seat waiting to respond. You had your answer in your head before she finished what she was saying. And she said to me, if you want people to listen, to hear you, listen to them first. Because you might actually hear what they're saying, and then you might know what they're thinking, and then you might even have a better idea of where you disagree. But all too often when we talk about issues in America today, we don't listen. And because we don't listen, people don't hear us. Instead of approaching a problem with humility, we approach it with hubris. We know everything. And actually, as a result of thinking we know, we end up making horrific mistakes. I actually started saying what I'm about to say during the Clinton years. This goes back to the 1990s, although being an activist leader in the Democratic Party, I wonder if we're ever going to not be in the Clinton years, but that's another story. I'm partisan. I was a Bernie supporter in 2016. Yay! Yeah. But I remember saying back then that since the end of Vietnam, that was in 1973, this is back in the 90s I said this, since the end of Vietnam, we have sent more troops, we've fought more wars, we've lost more lives, sent more weapons, sent more money, have more at stake in the Middle East than anywhere else in the world. And yet we don't have a clue what's going on there. And we continue to pour money, weapons, and expend political capital in the part of the world so absolutely critical for security and for stability, not just in that region, but in the world as a whole, without any sense of what's going on. After 9/11, it got worse in terms of our engagement in the region. And our engagement was, frankly speaking, stupid, because we kind of blundered in to a part of the world that we had so much going on, but we didn't know what was happening. I remember in 2003, I introduced a resolution. I was chair of the resolutions committee at the time in the Democratic Party. Very beginning of the year, we had a meeting before the actual invasion of Iraq. I introduced a resolution saying we should not go. I said we shouldn't go because we don't know, number one, what we're doing. We don't know what the outcome will be. We don't know what the terms of engagement are. We don't know what the commitment is. We don't have a clue about the culture and history of that country. I remember at one point in the middle of the early part of the invasion, I got a call from a reporter who wanted to know what I was thinking about when I saw the fall of the Saddam statue in Baghdad. And he said, "What are you thinking right now?" And I said, "What I'm thinking right now is I'm thinking about the Mongols." And he said, "What do you mean, the Mongols?" And I said, "Well, it's like they were the first who invaded Baghdad and took it over." And he said, "But doesn't it remind you of Paris?" And a lesson, just a little lesson. And it's not just a lesson for school and history, it's a lesson for life. Sometimes when we don't know something, we try to analogize something we do know and impose it on the reality we don't know. So for America, we looked at Iraq and we saw the liberation of Paris. For the Arabs, they looked at Iraq and they saw the Mongols, or they saw the British. Their optics was very different than our optics. But we didn't have a clue. We didn't know what was in their minds, and so we blundered in. I said back then that the biggest lie of that war was not weapons of mass destruction. The biggest lies of that war were that it would take 3 weeks, that in 6 months we'd be done and out, that it would cost $1 or $2 billion tops. That's what Wolfowitz said when he testified before Congress. 90,000 troops max, cost about $2 billion max, and then Iraqi oil would kick in and it would be, they'd pay for itself. And then we were told by the president at the time, George Bush, that he said there would be flowers in the street, they'd be heralding us as liberators, and democracy would bloom, not just in the Middle East, but would light a beacon, he said, throughout the whole Middle East. It would be a transformative event. That's what they said to us. And I think they actually believed it, because they just did not have a clue. At the time, I was also teaching at Davidson College in North Carolina, which is just a marvelous school. I did a semester there. I actually considered it payback because I sent 2 kids there and the tuition was so goddamn high that when they offered me a 1-semester teaching job at a very nice salary, I thought I'm either going to get a bench or salary or something named after me, so I would take the salary. My wife and I went there and spent the semester. And I was doing a weekly television show with a satellite network in the Middle East. And they had the idea that we would do a live satellite discussion a week before the war started with students at the University of Baghdad and my students at Davidson. The exchange was absolutely fascinating because my kids came out of that class with a sense, out of that TV show, with a sense of what was going on in the minds of the kids. One girl said to me after the show, she said, it was so hard to look at them in the eye and then know a week from now we were going to start bombing them. We had a show a month after the fall of Baghdad with the same kids. We brought them back again. And when I asked the first question, is this liberation or occupation? hands went up in Baghdad, it was occupation. My kids didn't get it, but the kids in Baghdad said, it's occupation because you're sitting in an auditorium, air-conditioned. We're on the rooftop of the University of Baghdad because there's no power. And so the show had to be done during daylight because there was no lighting available. You took a shower this morning and ate your breakfast. We have no running water in Baghdad right now. Your troops guarded the oil facilities and guarded some of the key ministries, but did nothing to provide us with security here. We don't feel you came to liberate us as much as it was to take over the regime and then take our resources. That's how people understood it there. And so when resistance began to develop, we didn't have a clue what was going on. We called them dead-enders. We said that these were the people who supported Saddam. But actually, we made enemies out of people who could have been our friends because we simply didn't know what we were doing. And if you think back or look back to those who advocated for the war, I sat on a Council on Foreign Relations study group right after 9/11 with a rather unseemly cast of characters. There were some of us who were on my side, but there were people like Newt Gingrich was in it, and Jim Woolsey, the former CIA guy, was in it, and Richard Pearl was in it, and just a strange cast of folks who, many of them, from even that point, like a month after 9/11, they were calling for invading Iraq. They said that's what we had to do. They were part of a group called the Project for a New American Century, which in the late 1990s had issued a document called Project for a New American Century, in which they argued that we needed a war. We needed to use decisive force in order to establish American hegemony and to show the world that we were going to be the dominant power in the new century. And that if we did it, if we used power in that way, we would end up dissuading any future enemies from challenging our supremacy, and we would secure our place and avoid the prospect of a multipolar world emerging. Because remember, this was just a short period of time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was a sense then that we were now the #1 power in the world, and if we used our power effectively, we could ensure that for the long term, America would be the #1 power. What happened? What happened? With Iraq, we ended up being tied down for years by a ragtag group of insurrectionists. We ended up with our young men and women serving 3, 4, sometimes 5 tours of duty. We ended up not only losing lives, losing enormous amounts of treasure, but we became, as a people, war-weary and wary of any new war. We ended up literally depleting our military assets and our treasure. I mean, the war probably is going to cost us in the range of $2 trillion by the time we're done. Because remember, we not only had to send hundreds of thousands of young men and women to fight, but when they came back, we had to then deal with everything from post-traumatic shock to actual horrific injuries and loss of capacity to operate. Poor General Shinseki, who before the war started, warned that it would take 355,000 troops. He got fired from the Pentagon, but then poor guy ended up becoming President Obama's head of Veterans Affairs, and he had to then deal with the fallout because as all these young folks kept coming back, he had to deal with the fact that the VA didn't have the money to deal with them. It also ended up creating a multipolar world. Iran, which had been, in fact, tied down because of Iraq, now became unleashed. And so when everybody today looks around at Iran as the emergent power, the reason Iran is the emergent power is because of the Iraq War. We freed Iran to seek what it had always sought, which was a foothold, not only in the Gulf region, but also in the north and the west. We also unleashed Al-Qaeda. which we were supposed to be defeating, but we ended up metastasizing it so that it spread like a cancer again throughout the entire region. Because we had no clue what we were doing, because we didn't know what the consequences of what we were doing was going to be, because we didn't know the people, the culture, the history of that area of the world, we ended up creating problems worse than the ones we fought to should try to eliminate. That's not the only blunder that we've made. There have been multiple ones. I remember that right after 9/11, George Bush gave a talk about why they hate us. And he said rather famously, they hate us because they hate our values. Well, I happen to be a pollster. My brother and I do polling. And so we did an extensive set of polling across the Middle East. And here's what we found. We found actually that they don't hate us. They don't hate our values. That while 80% of Americans said that Arabs hated our values, 80% of Arabs actually liked our values. And they liked our people. And they liked our products. And they liked our education system. And they liked so many aspects of our life. We actually did the poll because Gallup had done a poll right after 9/11 in which they simply asked the question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of America? And guess what? They had a very unfavorable view of America. I said at the time, that's like asking a woman who just threw her husband out of the house for being a serial cheat, how do you feel about men? It was the wrong question framed the wrong way at the wrong time. If you'd ask the question, what do you think about uncles? What do you think about fathers? What do you think about brothers? What do you think about sons? You might have gotten different. So we decided to parse out America in all the ways it manifests itself. And we found they like our values, they like our people, they like our culture, they like so many things. But then we said, what do you think about American policy toward Palestine? They hated it. What do you think about American policy in Iraq? They hated it. What do you think about American policy toward Muslims in the world? They hated it. And then we asked the question, which was the obvious follow-up, when you shape your attitude toward America, is it values or policy that is dominant? It was the policy. Actually, in a follow-up question, we asked to, after you do the polling, we then would do some qualitative focus groups, or we would just interview some individual people. We'd say, tell us a little more why you said that. One guy, I'll never forget him, he said, I studied in Boston. I love that city. I'm actually afraid to go there now because of this was when they were doing a lot of deporting of people, the Ashcroft crowd after 9/11, and harassing people at airports. He said, I love your country, but I don't think your country loves me. And he said, I feel like a jilted lover. And I never quite forgot that line because it was so evocative of the feeling that people had. We just didn't have a clue. The thing is that if that is the attitude, and we're trying to do public diplomacy, then maybe the last thing you want to do is a war in Iraq. I remember thinking to myself that when we invaded Iraq, it was like the nail in the coffin of American public, of attitudes towards America in the region. If you listen to what people say, and that was the key, if you listen to what they're saying, you actually would learn something about what you want to sell about America. I remember the woman who got the job being our first public diplomacy czar was Charlotte Beers, who had been the advertising executive who marketed Uncle Ben's rice. And she was very famous for having found all of the right language to use to sell Uncle Ben's rice. And I thought when she got the job, I said, this is really good. An advertising person knows that when you go into the market to sell a product, you have to understand what people want and what they're actually saying and listen to. She didn't sell America that way. I met with her right after she got the job. They asked to meet with me. And she said, what should I do? And I said, what any advertising executive does. Go out and test the market. Listen to people, find out what they want. Yeah, it's good. Instead, she went to Morocco and asked them, what do you think about America? And they said, you're Palestine. They talked about Palestine. She went to Tunisia and they said Palestine. She went to Egypt and they said Palestine. She gave up and she came home. It's not what she wanted to hear. And so she came home and she did that famous wanted dead or alive Osama bin Laden advertisement that appeared in Arab newspapers, which was not exactly the message that people, it may have worked here in America as cute and clever, but it didn't work as cute and clever there. It looked rather arrogant and cowboyish. And then the war in Iraq and our public diplomacy program was dead. I actually have worked with 3 different Arab television networks, and you guys will know, who watch Arab television, that American programs are on every network. I mean, from our westerns in Egypt, the term Kojak is a term that's used. You call people a Kojak. What?
Household name.
Yeah, because they love that television show. It's not just Baywatch that they used to watch. They watch all these shows, and they watch game shows. They watch. I remember there's an episode that I read about in the book about how I was in Tunisia, in Saudi Arabia rather, when Tunisia was in the midst of its unrest, and the government in Lebanon was falling, and I was at somebody's house and we were watching television, flipping back and forth from network to network, engaged in heated debate over Lebanon and its future, over Tunisia and its future. And one kid came in and looked at his watch and he said, "It's on!" And it was Arabs Got Talent. And the TV got turned to Arabs Got Talent, and we spent the next hour watching Arabs Got Talent, engaged in the same heated debate over who should win as they were with the other. Arabs watch TV to get entertained. And they like Arabs Got Talent, which is a spin-off of an American show. Just like Do You Want to Be a Millionaire? There was a spin-off of an American show, even down to the same stupid tie and shirt that kind of like nobody would wear in real life, but they wore it on the American show, and they franchised in the Middle East the same thing. Arabs, the myth we had was that Arabs wake up in the morning hating America, go to bed at night hating Israel, spend the time during the day at work, come home, go to the mosque where they hear a preacher hating America, and or watch Al Jazeera all day hating America at the same time. In fact, they end up watching TV just like Americans watch TV. Actually, mosque attendance rates in the Arab world are about the same as church attendance rates here. And Arabs are as faithful as Americans, not much more, not much less. And they watch TV that we do to be entertained. Just like Americans don't sit at home watching Fox all day, Arabs don't sit at home watching Al Jazeera all day. When something's big in the world, they turn on the news, just like we do. But they're people. They go to bed at night. When we ask them, what are your most important concerns? Their most important concerns are jobs and health care and education. Sound familiar? It's like us. I mean, they go to bed at night worried about their kids. They wake up thinking about their jobs. During the day, they worry about their parents and whether their parents are going to be well enough to take care of themselves and their old age and their pensions. And they do the same thing that anybody else does. But we don't think about that. We don't think about them as real people. We rather think about them as an abstraction. And because we see them as an abstraction, we make these horrific blunders that we make about them. We hollow them out and see them as a problem, not as people. And we don't think that they will judge events like we would judge events. You know, the do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Yeah, we don't think that if we're going to be bombing the hell out of Iraq, that maybe people aren't going to like that so much. If we turn a blind eye to 50 years of occupation of the West Bank and the dispossession of an entire people, that they're not going to really like us when we do that. There are consequences to our behaviors that we don't pay attention to because we don't see them as consequential people who matter and who will react to things just as we will, that they might be jilted lovers. They might get angry at us because we profess certain values, but we don't apply them back to them. And so, you know, what we find is that we continue to do this stuff over and over again, ignoring, and now we're doing it in Yemen, and not paying attention to the fact that there's this massive humanitarian crisis going on that we are held complicit in. It's not just Saudi Arabia that's held complicit, but America's supposed to be the sort of the country that professes values, that has a certain view of the world, that respects human rights, but we don't apply them. We don't apply them when we turn a blind eye to suffering, when it's not suffering of people that we identify with. Israelis are real people. Arabs are this hollowed out abstraction that we ignore. The question is why? Well, first of all, it's our education. I mean, number one, look, let's be honest about ourselves. We are an empire. We don't like to call ourselves an empire, but we are an empire. But we're ill-equipped to be an empire because we haven't got a goddamn clue about the world that we're governing. I mean, it's almost baffling. I remember when the Iraq War started, the first week, my wife and I, we were shell-shocked that it was going on, and the way it was going on, and the shock and awe and all of that stuff. And we went one night to a mall to buy something, and people were just, it was just, you would have thought that nothing was going on in the world at all. You know, movies and this and it was like, it was sort of like when you have a death in the family and you are grieving, and you kind of expect everyone else to feel it too, and when they don't, it's like, don't you get it? Something has happened here. And that's how I felt about America at the time when the war started. Number one, we've insulated ourselves from the war, so that like 8% of Americans actually fight in a war. Everybody else is absolved from it, right? We continue our life as if nothing is going on at all because it's not our son or daughter that's there. It's not our family that's affected. Unless you're actually in the military or you are Iraqi American, you didn't have a clue or even think about it because it wasn't your war. And we cannot feel compassion because we do not know the people. Why? Number one, our educational system sucks, to be quite brutally honest and crude about it. I remember when I was going to school, I used to look at our textbook. I called it Stone Age Man to Ike. It started, the social studies book started with the Stone Age man in Europe, southern Europe, caves in France. They found these Stone Age carvings. Well, it was interesting because the first man had to be from Europe because, of course, he couldn't possibly have been from Africa or something like that. I mean, for God's sake, I mean, he wouldn't have created the first man in any place other than Europe, right? I mean, then it went from Stone Age to, we did the Greeks and we did the Romans and then we did the Holy Roman Empire and then we did the Dark Ages and then you went to the Renaissance and then you went to the emergence of the nation state and then you went to World War I and II and then America. So it was Stone Age man to Ike. It was a pretty nifty trajectory. Now, there were other people, and so there was a little section on China. It was about Marco Polo discovering China, right? The Silk Road, we didn't even worry about that. I mean, that at the time of St. Paul, that there were Buddhists in Greece, right? Or that the Chinese had actually brought the greatest conveyors of civilization in the human history were the Mongols. We looked at them as the hordes, the invading hordes, but actually the cuisine of the Middle East comes from China. Whether you believe it or not, the vegetable, when my people were 2,000, 3,000 years ago, we were eating grains and product from, there was grapes, and there were sheep and milk products and stuff like that. But we didn't have squash. We didn't have, I mean, the things that become Lebanese cuisine, the sort of the high art cuisine, none of that stuff even existed. The idea of rolling stuff, that wasn't what we did. The rice, that wasn't what we did. All this stuff came when the Mongols brought them. Italians, I mean, the noodle came from Italy, from China, and the tomato came from Mexico. What the hell were the Italians eating 1,000 years ago? You know? But the idea that somebody else brought civilization to us was absolutely mind-boggling. Could not be. We did it all. The Dark Ages, we came out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. Why? Because the conveyors of civilization came from the South, from the Islamic world. They brought culture, they brought philosophy, they brought science. In fact, the early literature of Europe, some of it was just sheer translation from the Arabic. And yet we could not see that, partly because we never learned it. When you study the Arab in grade school, the picture I remember was a guy sitting on a camel with the pyramids in the background. And I think it was like product placement for Camel cigarettes at the time. It was like they were luring us into buying Camel cigarettes because that was the picture that was on the pack of cigarettes. But it was a chapter, nothing. It was 2 paragraphs on the Bedouin. And in the same chapter, that same section, there were also the Lapps. They were in Finland. Probably the only time Lapps are ever studied anywhere by anybody was in that section. They were the Bedouin of the tundra, as opposed to the Bedouin of the desert. And that was our exposure to the Arab. That there was a civilization there, that there was a conveying of culture to the north there, not a clue. Didn't exist at all. Even Jesus was blonde-haired, blue-eyed. I mean, he had to be, for God's sake. Couldn't look like me. I mean, we just had no idea, and we sheltered ourselves from it. So there was the sense that the rest of the world didn't really exist. It was a Eurocentric, American-centric education that we got. Well, if you didn't study it and learn it, and it continued, incidentally. When I wrote the book in 2010, of 2,400 university college programs in the country, there were only 50 that offered some programs in Middle East studies. Only 50 that offered a degree. And there were less kids studying Arabic than there were studying ancient Greek. Nothing against the ancient Greeks. They're nice people, I bet. But we did not send young men and women to fight in ancient Greece. We had kids in the Middle East and didn't have a clue. When the war in Iraq started, National Geographic did a survey. 11% of Americans could find Iraq on a map. 4 years later, they did a follow-up survey. The number jumped to 37%. By that time, we'd already lost 3,000 soldiers. And only 37% of Americans could find the place they died on a map. We didn't learn it. So where do we get our ideas from? Popular culture. And popular culture is notorious at conveying negative stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims. It shaped the ideas of an entire generation of Americans. Actually, if you go back to the very first films that involved Arabs, they were, as Edward Said would call them, they were romantic Orientalism. It was the desert sheikh. It was the mysterious sword in his a dagger in his teeth, and he was a lecherous character. Didn't get really, really negative until the '67 war and the famous film, The Exodus, which was not just a Hollywood film, but it was actually it was funded as a propaganda film to project the Israeli-Arab narrative in a very special way. And how did it do it? It took the cowboy and Indian notion of the white guys on the frontier confronting the savages who wanted to block their advance, and it superimposed the Israelis and the Arabs on that. So the Israeli guys were the blonde-haired, blue-eyed guys, and the Arab guys were the savages on the frontier. And it stuck in the mind of Americans for all that time. I mean, it's still, till this day, we are still haunted by that. The line was used just recently. We are the force of civilization, and we're confronting the desert barbarians. That was the idea that stuck in the mind of most people. Popular culture did that. As bad as popular culture was, media culture was no better. Media culture, which is where we get our news. I remember, I tell the story of I first moved from Philadelphia to central Pennsylvania. I was teaching at a small college in Shippensburg. The guy next door sort of eyed me warily for a couple of days. He came over to see me and he said, "You're new." I said, "Yeah, I'm new." He said, "You came from Philadelphia." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You live there?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "With your kids? It's dangerous there. People get murdered every day." And they did. I mean, if you read the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was the paper that they read out there, every day there was a murder in Philadelphia. In fact, there were like 3.5 million people in the suburban area. Kind of didn't matter. It was just there was a murder every day. And out there where he lived, there weren't a whole lot of murders in Carlisle, Pennsylvania at the time. And he saw it as this jungle. And any American reading a newspaper about the Middle East, that's the view you get. I mean, if Ahmed is a doctor and gets up in the morning and delivers a couple of babies and then, you know, goes to the hospital and does his rounds and comes home at night, that's not a story. But if Ahmed straps a bomb to himself, then he's front page news. I mean, even in America today, you can, if there's a murder, a mass murder in Las Vegas, we think about it for a couple days, and then it's over. But if it's an Arab or a Muslim who does it, then we have hearings in Congress, and we have major press conferences, and we want to pass laws, and we want to do all this stuff because it's different. It's a different story. I think about this a lot because the idea that, I mean, there was an article in the paper the other day. I follow the news, obviously, from the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. It was my first, I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign back in the 70s, and I was sort of consumed. I spent time in the refugee camps in Lebanon in the early 70s, and then I worked with Vice President Gore in the West Bank in the 90s, and pay a lot of attention to that. And almost daily, there are house demolitions. There are settlers tearing up. This is olive harvest time, and settlers beating up Palestinian farmers, not allowing them to harvest their olives, and stealing the olive crop so that they can keep it for themselves. And it goes on every single day. Not a mention in the Washington Post. But there was a story the other day, a big one, half page, about Israeli women joining the military. It was a nice human interest story. But where was the human interest story about Palestinians? Where's the human interest story about just ordinary Saudi people, about ordinary people in Lebanon, about people just living their lives? There will be human interest stories about people, but not human interest stories about the problem. Because the problem isn't people. They don't exist for us as people with a story to tell. The story is the Israelis. The Arabs are problems, and so they're an abstraction. We don't talk about them in just the same way. And that translates as well to the political culture, which is where a lot of the media culture comes from. It's the political culture. I mean, you have a Senate contest here between a guy who, despite everything else that he's done and said and whatever, thinks Islam is a fake religion, wants to deport Muslims, believes that Keith Ellison shouldn't have been sworn into Congress because he's a Muslim, and on and on and on, running against a guy who's literally said nothing about the Middle East at all, which in my book then becomes a good thing, as opposed to actually challenging and saying some positive things. At least he doesn't say anything at all. But that's the level of debate. I mean, the question is, you're going to send somebody who's going to be one of 100 people in the U.S. Senate making decisions, life and death decisions about a whole region of the world. One of them thinks Islam is a fake religion and Muslims are evil, versus somebody else who hasn't said anything about it at all. And that's okay. That's where we are. And that's not just here. That's almost every contest that we have in the country. We do not have a political debate about the reality of the issues facing that region. And facing not just the region, it's not as if it's like over there, but it involves us over there. We're there. We have not as many troops as we had, but we got thousands in Iraq. We have thousands in Syria. We're fighting drone wars and have troops on the ground actually in Yemen and in Somalia, etc., etc., etc. As if we don't have anything to do about it. We don't have to say anything about it. What are you going to do about Libya? And I bet you would get from the politician, you would ask that question, what's that got to do with me? What do I have to talk about that for? Well, because we created the problem in Libya, because we overthrew the dictator without any attention to what was going to come after. What are you going to do about Egypt? Well, that's got nothing to do with me. Well, yeah, it does actually, because we've been supporting the government in ways that have contributed to the arrest of tens of thousands of people and a deplorable human rights record, which is going to come back and kick them in the butt at some point, because it's a danger. Could we be advising in a different direction? If we thought about it, if we actually cared about it, if we actually understood it, we might actually say some different things or do some different things. But we don't have anybody in government who's actually doing this. Oh yeah, we got people in policy advisors. You have the president is surrounded by a group of people who don't have a damn clue. Not a clue at all. Jason's going to figure it out. Jared's going to figure it out. This is the first time they ever been. Oh yeah, Jared's been to Jerusalem a couple of times, and Jason has been in the West Bank settlements, and Friedman actually has an apartment in Jerusalem. But there's a whole world out there, and we don't have a clue. And so because our educational system doesn't help, our popular culture hurts, and it's reinforced by our media culture and our political culture, we end up with these either no information or negative stereotypes about a region that is absolutely critical. The result is that we make horrific mistakes. What can we do about it? And I'll stop there because I've got lots of questions. One of the things you can do is take advantage of the resources you have here. I mean, you have a program that's starting to do some education in the university. You've got wonderful people in your community who actually know something, who actually can help you learn something. And yeah, you know what? If you get 5 Arabs together in a room from different countries, they're all going to have different views. But you know what? That's life. You get 5 Americans together in a room, they got different views too. And out of the complexity of all of those views, what you learn is at least one thing. They're people just like us. They're people just like us with different views, and they care about things. They care about their lives, they care about their children, they care about their futures, they care about their countries. They care about being respected as real people. And if you learn nothing else, you'll learn that. And frankly, you'll never be able to then look at Yemen again in the same way after you've met these guys and said, wait a minute, I have to pay attention to that place. Another thing you can do, I have in my book, Arab Voices, I can recommend you buy Arab Voices. The internet, I mean, the internet is like, it's the greatest thing ever and it's the worst thing ever. Because it's like, my kids went to 2 schools, Davidson College in North Carolina, and they went to University of Virginia. As bright as my kids who went to University of Virginia were, I mean, one graduated summa cum laude, the other went to law school and got the Robert F. Kennedy Award for best representing the ideals of the late senator. My 2 kids who went to Davidson actually got better educated. And I'll tell you why. Because University of Virginia 30, 40,000 students. And when you're on the campus there, because it's so big, you end up gravitating toward people just like you. And so my son, who'd been very close growing up to Jesse Jackson's son, because I did his campaigns and he got to be close to one of his kids, when they were on campus together, the black kids all hung together and the white kids all hung together, and he couldn't cross the barrier. My daughter was a bit of a hippie, and so she hung with the hippie crowd. She followed the Grateful Dead, actually, without me even knowing about it. I'm in Boston, Dad. Why are you in Boston? Well, the Dead are here this week. I said, Elizabeth, you got school. Yeah, but the Dead is whatever. So, I mean, I got that going on. But then I had my kids at Davidson. Remember, my daughter was convinced that's where she wanted to go because the guy who took us around was in the chess club, right? I.e. nerd. I mean, complete nerd. But he was saying hi to the football players and introduced them to the football players, and then they got to meet some of the basketball players, and then they got to meet some of the, and it's like small enough where you interacted. Now the internet does the same thing. It creates too much possibility for too much information. So we end up siloing ourselves into only reading the information that reinforces what we already think. You end up hanging with the hippies, or hanging with the radio club, or hanging with the whatever. And so people who follow Huffington Post don't also go to Drudge, or vice versa. And so by getting only one source of information, you end up reinforcing the stereotypes or the bad information or good information, whatever it is, that you already have and know. What I present in the book, Arab Voices, are alternative places you can go on the internet. I mean, almost every Arab country has a newspaper in English, which is their paper in English translated. And you can get the Yemen Times, or you can get Al Ahram Weekly, or you can get Saudi news, or you can get Gulf news, or you can get the Sudan has an English. I mean, there isn't an Arab country that doesn't have an English language paper that you can read. You can read papers from Israel in English. Haaretz in English is just great. I read it every single day. Every day I read it. And I read the Jerusalem Post in English. And they're all free, incidentally, to anybody who wants to do it. I remember every time I go to a place, I insist on reading the news. My wife and I go to Ireland a lot. And I love when I get there, I buy like 4 newspapers the first day. And then I do it every single day. And by the time a week has passed, whatever part of the country we're in, knowing what debates are going on in their dial, the parliament, or knowing what issues are roiling in the country, listening to talk radio, absolutely fascinating. And you get a feel for like what's happening in the place you're in. And if you don't, you miss out the experience. Then it's just like, oh, look at that old tower, or oh, look at that great castle, or oh, look at that whatever. But instead, I can end up feeling like this is what Irish people are thinking about right now. This is the problems that they're having. These are the things they care about. And it gives you a whole different feel for a place. So when I would teach, I would always have my kids pick a country, and every day follow the newspaper in that country, and then begin to tell me not how they were reporting on a big international story, but what are the little stories? What are the human interests? What are the daily life stories in Beirut that they're writing about and thinking about right now? And it opens it up. So the internet provides you with an opportunity. People, real people in your communities who can inform you, and the availability of the internet to educate you where you can't find it anywhere else. I would just recommend you do that. You also could buy my book, Arab Voices. I used to say the book was about myths that Americans have about Arabs. And every place I'd go, when I was doing my book tour, people would say, well, you just told us about the myths that Arabs have about America, or that Americans have about Arabs. What are the myths that Arabs have about Americans? And I'd say, well, the first one is they think we're really smart. And I mean that quite seriously. They think we're smart. so that when we do really stupid stuff, they can't believe it's really stupid stuff. They believe we really had to have a reason for it. Hence, conspiracy theories develop. Oh, the Americans are really doing this because, and they wanted to do this, and they wanted to overthrow Saddam so that they would, no, it was really stupid stuff. But they don't get that. So the book is great, incidentally, and it's still available. And you can follow me on Twitter. It's JJZ1600. JJZ1600. It's a delightful Twitter. I have wonderful. I've only been doing it for a year, but it is so much fun. My wife says I'm going to get myself in huge trouble, but I really enjoy it a lot.
You have 280 now. You have 280 characters.
You have 280 characters, yeah, for Twitter.
I do, but I'm still stuck at 140. My wife said to me one time, she said that I was meant to operate in 140 characters because she said you're quick like that. But she said the problem is that if you'd gone into toothpaste, we'd be rich. But you had to try to sell people what they don't want to buy, Arabs. But no, yeah, I do. I go over sometimes, but I do have fun with it.
Is your tweet better than Trump's? Is your tweet better than Trump?
I hope it's saner. Did you see his tweet after the Korean guy, the one?
Fat and...
Whoa! I mean, I'd like to get him on a couch and take notes. Tell me all about it. What's bothering you? Your daddy. I have a theory about presidents, period, generally, and it applies to all of them. I was going to write the thing in '92. I was at the Democratic Convention in '92, and they did this video of Bill Clinton right before he came to speak, and it made this totally dysfunctional family into the Kennedys almost. You know, it was like, it was weird. It was weird. And then Al Gore came out and was on stage and has brought his father out, and Gore went off stage, and and Al Gore Sr. was still there waving at the crowd, and they finally had to come and drag him off the stage. And Jerry Brown came back because he wanted to be vice president too, years ago. And then Jerry Brown, when he got to speak, he started off the speech by saying, "I want to dedicate this speech to the greatest Democrat who ever lived, my father." And he wouldn't let his father come to his inauguration as governor when he was first there. He hated his father. They didn't talk at all. And so I was going to write the article called "Democrats and Their Dads," because I like the alliteration. But then I began to realize that the more study I got into it, that it was Republicans too, and I couldn't quite think of the way to, politicians and their pops or something. But I'm almost convinced that you do not run for president unless you have an abusive, absent, or alcoholic father. And I don't mean that. No. I'm not meaning it. Look, I've done presidential campaigns going back to the 80s. I was deputy campaign managers and senior advisors to at least 5 different candidates. And I feel bad about it. I'm not saying it to be disrespectful, but the process is so abnormal. It's just not good. And you would not do it unless you needed that kind of affirmation. And I don't think you would need, healthy people do not run for office like that. Because you just don't, you would not subject yourself to it. And it's transformative of your life. I mean, you do not run for office and become the same person when it's over. And I've seen it with too many people. I remember Al Gore after he lost. And, think about this. Anytime you ever meet a politician after they've been in office, they're actually happy people. It's almost like the cloud is gone. And they can be themselves. And there's something about that process that just doesn't work. And Donald Trump is classic in that way. I mean, his relationship with his father was horrible, horrible. And he's still working it out. And I'm not sure that his kids are doing any better. with their relationship with him. I wouldn't want to be barren. I'm telling you. No, so I wasn't being disrespectful there. I was just being quite. I think it's
Observation.
it ain't good. But that's another story. So I'm going to end there and take any questions you might have. Thank you very much. And come on Thursday to hear Jeremy. Thursday. Okay. Any questions? I'm going to start actually with the students. If you
Okay.
like. Yes.
So I have a 2-year-old son. What's the best way to raise him with America's public education to understand all the different cultures of the world and to actually treat them like people?
You know, my kids joke with me all the time about they've learned from me. Whenever I get into a cab, I say to the driver, "Where are you from? And what do you do? And tell me about what you did over there." And they say, every time you get into a cab, you end up making a friend. I just find it interesting to learn from people, all the people I meet, as many as I meet in a day. And so I think that if your kids see you respectful of others, not seeing the other as an other. Did you ever hear of Martin Buber, the Jewish theologian, wrote a book, I, Thou? And the idea is knowing the other as a thou, as instead of an it, as an object. I gave a talk one time in the UAE, in Bahrain. I was in Bahrain at a human rights conference. It was before the G20. They have the what do they call it? The Forum of the Future. All the NGOs come together whenever the G20 meets. They do a separate forum. And I went to this thing, and I was going to speak on human rights. And as I was out in the lobby, the various guys who were there were a couple thousand people there. And they were, what do you call it? They were, make sure you buy my book. No, I'm kidding. I'm not, actually. No, they were butting their cigarettes out on the floor, and they were saying to the maids, not the maids, the waiters and stuff, give me a coffee, like this. So when I got up to speak, I said, I was going to talk about human rights in your countries, but I want to talk about something else. You cannot build a humane society on the backs of the people who clean up after you, the people who build your buildings, who take care of your kids, and who you end up ignoring as if they're not real people in your midst. And so, you know, I think just part of the way you open children up to a different reality is to see that no one is an object and everyone is a real person. Whether it's the waitress in the restaurant, or the cab driver, or the person cleaning up the street, whatever, to engage in some way that person so that your kids see them as real people. And then, you know, I mean, like I said, there's no place in America today that is just one people. You know, the complexity of our cultures. You've got restaurants here from different cultures. You have so many different ethnic groups and immigrant groups here. Find opportunities to show them that world. I mean, the world is with us right now. We have an opportunity to take advantage. Don't be the University of Virginia. Try to make it Davidson. Try to make it where you end up engaging more instead of just siloing to your own type. And I think that's the start of education. The rest of it will flow if they're open to the world. Yeah.
You mentioned that in '67, the movie, the release of the Exodus.
It was actually before 67.
Okay.
Yeah.
But given that that was kind of the Israeli narrative, how much has that carried over into the modern age?
So, still with us. The Arab-Israeli conflict in the American mind remains the Israeli people versus the Arab problem, the Palestinian problem. What do we solve? How do we solve the problem so the Israelis will be secure and free? I mean, that becomes the focal point. And whenever you look at the presidents, I mean, whether it was going back to whenever, the only different one was Jim Baker. But by and large, the Middle East peace team, quote unquote, has been Jewish and has been focused on what do we do to make Israel secure. My son was at the State Department for about 8 months in the 90s. And two groups wanted to have him fired because they didn't want the Arab kid there. And he ended up getting his presidential appointment shifted over to the Justice Department because he just didn't want to deal with it. But it stuck with me. I remember Madeleine Albright came to me and she said, you know, she said, I don't want him to leave. Please talk to him to stay. And he said he just doesn't want to be the one Arab kid in a team of 10 people, all 9 of whom are Jewish. And we've never raised that as an issue. We never made that an issue. But they've now made it an issue. And he doesn't want to be the sort of the odd one out. He's got a career, he's just starting. He doesn't want to be the poster boy for this. And so he left and he went over there. But that look, I mean, do we have in the White House now, in the National Security Council, do we have Arabs or Arabists even who understand Yemen, who understand Palestinians, who understand Syrians or Iraqis? And the answer is no, we don't. No, we don't. And as long as that's the case, you know, we continue to blunder that way, because the emphasis in American politics is on what do we do to make Israel secure? What are our goals in the Middle East? Security of Israel, oil, and fighting terrorism. That's it. Is it the well-being, prosperity, development of Arab peoples? No. It's not even, we don't even think about it. The only president who ever did was Obama, and he got beaten down. He got beaten down for it. His second anniversary Cairo speech was, just brilliant. I'll never forget, I was at the State Department listening to it, and he said the Arab Spring has started. He said, we didn't start it, we can't direct it, we can't determine its outcome, but we can be of help. And then he listed the things we could do, none of which ever happened because Congress was never going to give them the light of day. They would time of day rather, they wouldn't do it. So, yeah, sorry. You had a hand, yeah.
Yes, on the comment that you made about the man from Boston that said,
Yeah.
I love America, but America doesn't love me.
Yeah.
I really related to that, and I wanted to ask if people in the Arab world, do they see the treatment of African Americans like police brutality, the killing of unarmed black women, men, and children? Do they have, what are their reactions to that? What are their thoughts? Do they see any similarities to their own lives?
You know, they actually do. And when you see, there has been, especially after Ferguson, which sort of elevated it in the national discourse here, you see the language being used there. Palestinian lives matter, or Yemeni lives matter, or Iraqi. People use that language. And some of the BLM leadership have actually gone to the Middle East and or have hosted folks here from there. So it's interesting that those connections are being made. I think part of the problem is that, though, and I'll be really honest with you, as stereotypical as we are in dealing with Arabs, part of our problem with projecting our image to the region has also been stereotypical. I mean, the TV shows that get marketed there they create a positive image of American life, but they don't create a real image of American life. I was telling the Yemeni friends here that when I remember when I went to Yemen, the State Department had me come and do a series of conversations with people before their first elections in '93. And I remember being in one session, and they were complaining that the ruling party was tearing their signs down during the election. And I said, yeah, that happens in Chicago a lot, you know. And then went to another one, and they said, yeah, you know, the ruling party's passing money out, and they're, you know, see, yeah, we call that walking around money. That's a big issue in Philadelphia all the time. And we went to a session, finally the guy at the embassy said to me, what are you telling them that for? And I said, because it's true. And I said, if we pretend that we're the Cindy Crawford of elections, then no one can ever be a democracy ever. But if we let them know our flaws, then we can have a conversation. You approach it from humility, not hubris. And yet too much of our public diplomacy operates from hubris. It's like we're perfect, we're great, we're really good. And then when our flaws come out, instead of it being seen as we're really people too, and we really have problems too. One of the lines that always gets an Arab audience when I talk to them is, I tell them I nominated Jesse Jackson for president in 1984. I gave the nominating speech at the convention, and I started it off with, I'm the son of an illegal immigrant. I am. My father was illegal. And I'm going to nominate for president the great-grandson of a slave. Only in America. If you start with the narrative of the reality that we have illegals and we had slavery and then you can tell the story of how we've tried to make progress since. But if you start with we're here, then we got nothing to, there's no conversation. It's like, you little brown people, what are we going to do to help you? You know, get better. Whereas we're all in this together. We got problems together. We got to approach it together. And I long for the day that a politician would actually start with, we got problems, you got problems, let's talk. Which is actually the Cairo Obama speech was exactly that, which is why I focus a whole chapter in my book on it. Because despite the fact that it didn't happen, and he wasn't able to do it, I remember I was on a number of TV shows after he gave the speech. I was actually watching the speech with Liz Cheney, Vice President Cheney's daughter, on CNN, and we were commenting on it right after the speech. And at the end of a weekend of doing these shows, the woman at CBS, on the CBS Sunday morning show, said, well, do you think he can ever close the divide? And I said, with Muslims, I think he could. But with Republicans, I'm not sure he could. Because they wouldn't give him any slack at all. Not at all. They termed, the minute the speech was over, the talking points were out. It was an apology. He disgraced America. He did this. And he didn't. By saying that we've made mistakes does not disgrace us. It tells you who we are and what problems we've got and opens the door to a conversation. So, yeah, I mean, I think I talk all the time when I'm in the Middle East about our problems with racism and more. I mean, for a society that has lectured the world on the treatment of women, wow, do we have some stories to tell, don't we? I always say, you know, when you look at the Arab world, and there was a really wonderful picture in the New York Times years ago. In Turkey, it was a woman in hijab walking past a billboard with a woman in a bikini and a suntan thing. And I remember looking at that picture, and they were doing it, oh, look at the contrast, whatever. And I said to myself, which society respects women more? Which society treats women as objects? Actually, both do. Both do. But we don't see the one, and they don't see the other, you know? And so the issue of listening and understanding really becomes, I think, it's almost a lifelong quest to try to get to it. There's something over here. I'm going to do you, and then you. Yeah. And then we're going to call. Yeah.
2 years ago, I saw a small clip on the movie Exorcist. And I unfortunately am not able to but it shows a very positive depiction of an Arab family giving land to a Russian Jewish community.
Yeah.
And it was very short-lived. So I'm going to just want to point that out, that they showed some humanity and
Well, if you watch the whole film, you come away with a very different view.
One more thing I wanted to ask you. Recently, there was some shuffling going on in the Democratic Party, and your name, and I saw you. And
I got shuffled.
Yes, Keith Ellison. Can you talk about what really happened? Who was behind all of this?
Well, listen, I'm on the party's Unity and Reform Commission, and I believe that after a contested election in 2016 and a contested election for chair in 2017, we needed to come together. And as Jesse Jackson used to say, a plane needs two wings to fly. You need the progressive wing and you need the establishment wing. You can't do one without the other. Unfortunately, the party chair did not seem to agree. And so he purged most of the Bernie and Ellison people from the leadership. And I was one of those that got purged. But it's not over. And we still have the Unity and Reform Commission. Our proposals come forward next month, and then we debate them in our meeting in February. And I'm hopeful that we'll make some progress, because the party needs to unify both of its wings in order to move forward. And I'm not giving up on it at all. But I think we had a bit of a setback, just a bit of one. Yeah?
Well, actually, he's the first part of my question. You began to answer getting partisan here, talking about the Democrats. You've spent a lifetime, virtually a lifetime, in that party, trying to get it, not just the leadership, but the leadership that would convince the Democrat electorate to do, in quotes, the right thing about Palestine, the right thing about attitudes and sane policies with respect to how we should proceed in the Middle East. After all that time, where we are today, what's your...
Do you want me to just cry?
What's your...
I said, do you want me to just cry?
Well, that's what I want to...
No, let me tell you. Let me tell you.
What's your prospect for the future?
You know, it would be great. It would be great if we would have a situation where you throw something out and everybody says, yeah, that's right, you know, whatever. But the process is incremental. And there are setbacks and there are advances, and then there are times where you don't even think anything's happened, and it really is. And I look at the polling. We just finished another poll. I mean, as a Democrat, as an American, I feel, but as a Democrat, I feel great. I mean, if you look at Democrat numbers on attitudes towards Arabs and Muslims and Palestine and issues involving the Middle East, they're like 60, 20, 70, 15. I mean, the numbers are through the roof positive. Republican numbers are almost a mirror image, negative. So it sort of comes out in the wash. But what's driving it? What's driving it is, I'm going to sit. What's driving it is demographics. We do not have as much a partisan split as we have a demographic split in America today. With young people, educated women, African Americans, minorities of all sorts, Asian, Pacific, and Latino, on one side of the ledger. And middle-aged, middle-class white people, in particular those who classify themselves as born again on the other side. Not speaking, I'm not being disparaging, I'm just saying that that's where the demographic split is. And so it's mirror image of each other. And I think about it a lot, obviously, it's my life's work. And the one thing that keeps coming back to me is something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, which is attitudes towards gays and gay marriage. Think about where we were 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, and look at where we are today. It was revolutionary, transformation in thinking in the country. And I have to believe that the same possibility is there And it'll just catch. Like I said, you throw the bait out, and sometimes it gets caught, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's there. It's there in the culture, and it begins to catch on. I just think that we're slower than I'd like it to be, but I see the change happening. You know, when Bernie put me on the platform committee, the drafting committee, oh my God, the press reaction was pro-Palestinian. The Washington Post headline, Sanders picks pro-Palestinian. When he said on his first Meet the Press show, I have advisors like Jim Zoghby, the Jewish community went nuts. And then all of a sudden they didn't go nuts because there were more Jewish supporters of me. Let me tell you a funny story. I got invited to speak at a synagogue in 2006. And now, some of you aren't going to like this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. In 2006, Rabbi called me 3 times to say he wanted me to talk about the backlash against Arabs and Muslims after 9/11. I said, fine, it's great. My life had been threatened. 3 people went to jail for threatening my life or my family's life after 9/11. So I was fairly well equipped to deal with it. So after the 3rd time he called me and said, please don't talk about the Middle East, I said, if you don't want me to come, I don't have to come. You know, so, no, I just don't, you can't talk about the Middle East. It's too sensitive. People don't want you coming. I said, all right. You know, I'm walking out on the stage and he whispers, remember, don't talk. I said, I get it. I'm not going to do it. So I went out and I gave my talk on the backlash, and it was great. Everybody loved it. It was fine. And then the questions came. Every single question was about the Middle East. And we got along famously because my views and their views were not that dissimilar. You know, till the last question came up. And the last question, some old guy in the back of the room said, where do you stand on mixed marriage? And I'm thinking to myself, there's a catch here. I just didn't get it, right? So I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, it all depends what you mean. My mother and father were both Zoghbys, although I don't have 6 toes, because they were distant parts of the same family. And they come from the same village, but my mother's mother came from Baskinta, which is across the wadi, across the valley, on the other side of the valley. And it's a more prosperous village, and the rivalry between the two had developed over the last like 100 years, and it become quite intense. When I got to Lebanon, for the first time I went in 71, my family there in my father's village, you're from Biscuit. That's why you're, because I was pro-Palestinian and they weren't. Of course, your mother's from Biscuit. Okay, fine. That was a mixed marriage to them, my mother and father. My wife is Irish Catholic and I'm Maronite Catholic. My mother-in-law was convinced that it was not really the same thing and that I didn't believe in the Pope and her daughter was going to go to hell for marrying me. That was a mixed marriage. My son is married to a Muslim. My daughter's married to a Jew. Another son is married to a Methodist and a daughter is married to a Baptist. And that's mixed marriage. I said, I guess I do. We call it America. That's what we do. Well, it was like there was an age split in the room. Everybody like under 40 thought it was just the coolest thing ever, and the older guys were just like beside themselves with like, it's an outrage. It's going to dilute the people, whatever, the race, and whatever. It's like, yeah, but that's what we do. You know, they're all my grandkids, and I love them all, and they love me, and they all call me Jiddu. So, but you know, I think that the change is there, and it's real, and it's generational. And the interesting thing about what's happening is that when we grew up, you and I, we looked to the older generation for direction. The greatest generation, we call them. And what we're finding today in our polling and in our focus groups is that older people are looking to youth culture for direction. I mean, I can't tell you, when I was doing Obama's campaigns, I can't tell you how many people would come up to me after a speech and say, I'm only here because my kids wanted me to come. Yeah. And Bernie, it was the same thing. Old people came to Bernie's things because their kids wanted them to be there, right? That's unusual. And And so I happen to think that there's a change, and I just hope it keeps developing. And I'm going to go to you for the last question, and then I guess we got to stop. Yeah.
You know, every time you talk to average lay American people who do not understand about the Middle East conflict,
They end up a whole lot better informed when I'm done. No, I'm kidding.
They say, well, this is 1,000 years of conflict going on, and how do you combat such ignorance? This is my question.
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
1,000 years of this conflict between Arab and Palestinians and Israel, Jewish people.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about that. There are no thousands of years battles anywhere. You know, one of the things I write about in the book is the notion that the Arab world's at war, and it's always been at war, and they make war, and all they do is make war. Golda Meir said that. I feel so bad for the other side. She said, over here, she said, we love and we dance and we make music, and the Arabs, all they do is hate us and kill, that kind of thing. That notion is there, but it's totally ahistorical, and it's racist. I mean, look at Europe last century. How many tens of millions, not millions, how many tens of millions died in Europe in the last century? Don't talk to Arabs about, you people, all you know how to do is make war, because nobody committed atrocities like Europe did in the last century. And even when they weren't murdering their own people in Europe, they were colonizing and exploiting the hell out of North Africa and South Asia and America, and yet we absolve them of it. And so the British sit there and they say, well, it doesn't correspond with our liberal values. Screw your liberal values. Your liberal values enslave the damn world. Pardon me if there's anybody British here who supports British imperialism. I remember I was in Britain in '71 on my way to Lebanon, and we spent a week there, and I'm reading all the newspapers, like I always do. And I'm reading the papers, and there was Ireland, and there was Nigeria, and there was South Africa, and there was India, Pakistan, and Israel, Palestine. And the British papers, the cartoons and the editorials are, these savages are going at each other, whatever. And I'm saying to myself, like about 3 days of it, I said, wait, you all created every one of these. You created Ireland. You created the problem in Nigeria. You created South Africa. You were the ones who did it in India. And it wasn't just, I mean, if you watch the movies even, Gandhi, think of how many people they just mowed down. Look at the French in Algeria. How many people did they mow down? And the French are talking to us about liberal values today? Give me a break. And America too. I mean, our country was born with original sin. Slavery and genocide against indigenous peoples. I mean, nobody in this world is pure. No one. And yet we approach everything with hubris and not humility. There's a wonderful book, I was telling Tina about it, called Culture and Dignity by Ralph Nader's sister. It's a marvelous book about the need to approach cultures with a sense of humility and being open to understanding them. So, if you go back to Balfour, if you go back, I mean, look, I'm a pollster, and I love polling. The first poll ever done in the Middle East was the King Crane Commission. Woodrow Wilson found out what the British designs were for Palestine, and he said, I don't think I like this. I want people to determine for themselves where they want to go. So he sent over King Crane, 2 guys, one an industrialist, one a university president, and asked them to survey. They conducted a survey. They surveyed over 2,000 people throughout the greater Syria region and asked them, what do you want? Where do you think it ought to go? What do you do, whatever. The results of the commission were clear. They didn't want a mandate, they wanted unity, and they didn't support a Zionist presence. They supported coexistence, but they wanted Palestine to be part of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, a unified region, independent. And one man, one vote. Balfour, when he heard of it, his quote was, the aspirations of the Arab people mean nothing to me. and are less important to us than the goals that we've set for the Jewish movement in Palestine. Well, of course they're not going to like that, and they're going to have a war over it. And when in 1921, these Europeans first started coming into Palestine, and they're marching with flags down the street in Jerusalem saying, "We want a Jewish state, Arabs out now." Of course they were going to react negatively. So saying there's like this age-old... There were Arabs living in Palestine that were Jewish and Muslim and Christian. They got along fine. There were tensions, as there always are in tribal society, traditional society, but nothing like what happened after one people was picked out and empowered and another people were disempowered. That created the violence that we're living with. Same with Muslims and Hindus. Same in South Africa. I mean, you cannot spit on people, kick people, dispossess people, and not have them strike back. Age old? No. That's where we are. Even now with this Iran, Saudi thing, age old Sunni Shia. Bullshit, pardon my French. It's just not true. Actually, in polling we did in the region, in different phases, the most, I mean, Iran's favorable rating was high. The only reason for the division is it's not a Sunni Shia, it's becoming that. They're using that language. But it actually originates with a power struggle between who's going to be the dominant force in the Gulf. That's the issue. It's a political struggle. And we don't understand that. So we go behind Saudi Arabia's back and make a deal with Iran, which was a good deal. But if we'd not done it behind their back and brought them in on it, it would have been a different story. But we didn't have a clue. And I'd go to the Obama folks and I'd say, why don't you invest the Saudis in this? Make them feel a partner with you. They wouldn't accept it. I said, well then, how do you know? Did you talk to them? No, we just know that they won't, so we have to do it secretly. No, the best way to end up with a fight is by trying to play one side against the other and hope that they won't, they'll just buy it because you did it. I mean, anyway.
I have a question.
Yes. Last one.
Yeah,
Okay, very last one.
okay.
Make it an easy
Sure.
one. Yeah.
Back in 2000, when I was a student at Emory,
Yeah.
we had Aaron Miller.
Yeah.
It's a very famous, politician.
My neighbor.
Yeah, so, we're students, and I think at that time we had the second uprising in the West.
Yeah.
And we were like kind of, tense, and, and we asked him this simple question. We said, so when is the US policy going to change in the Middle East? And when basically all governments are going to at least stop being biased, towards Israel. And we touched on an issue that probably you didn't really touch on, which is the lobbyists, which is the pro AIPAC,
Yeah.
and pro-Israel.